Tonight, 8 people are facing charges after running onto the field at the Congressional Baseball Game.
We are going to not charge taxes on tips, people making tips.
What do I like about communism?
Leftist activists show they're crazy again. The New York Times' bias gets exposed, Trump's interesting new economic proposal, and a TikToker supports killing billionaires? All this and so much more is coming up on today's episode of Brad vs. Everyone, my daily podcast where I take on the craziest ideas from across our politics and across the internet from a center-right, independent perspective. If you're new here, please consider subscribing and sticking around. And if you're a returning viewer, you know what I'm about to say. Don't forget to hit that like button and do leave a comment. I read the comments and I pick a few to respond to in every episode. Now, before we get into our topics for today, I want to briefly touch on something highly contentious. There's a debate popping off on Twitter right now over mayo on hot dogs. A lot of people are saying this is so gross, why would anyone do this? And all I'm saying is I would try it. Let me know in the comments what you think. Now up first, we've got to talk about the latest incident involving left-wing crazy climate activists.
How dare you!
Because they've just targeted yet another public event for disruption and protest. The annual Congressional Baseball Game, where Democratic and Republican members of Congress face off in a baseball game. It's a popular event in DC, insiders inside the Beltway all go. It was disrupted by climate activists who stormed and did a field invasion. They were tackled and arrested. Let's take a look at some local footage from WUSA 9.
Tonight, 8 people are facing charges after running onto the field at the Congressional Baseball Game. You can see right here. This is video from just a few hours ago at Nats Park. Capitol Police tell us the people were part of a protest group. They have been charged with interfering with a member of the U.S. Capitol Police.
The 8 protesters were affiliated with a group called Climate Defiance, and they were protesting for a, quote, end to fossil fuels. As NBC reports, 8 protesters were arrested Wednesday night during the Congressional Baseball Game, a yearly tradition that raises money for charities. U.S. Capitol Police officers quickly stopped and arrested 8 people as they tried to protest on the field. Police said the protesters are being charged with interference with a member of the U.S. Capitol Police, a federal charge. The Capitol Police Public Information Office told NBC News that the protesters are still in police custody, where they are being processed and will be taken to jail. It also said no injuries were reported during the arrests. The group Climate Defiance took responsibility for the protest, NBC reports, posting pictures to X of protesters wearing shirts reading, "End fossil fuels," and jumping onto the field and being tackled or arrested by police officers. Of course, these activists are framing themselves as bold heroes. 8 of us have been arrested for shutting down the Congressional Baseball Game. They are behind bars right now, the group said in a post. Make no mistake, it's the members of Congress who should be locked up. Reached for comment, organizer Evan Drucker-Shardle said, Congress and the fossil fuel industry have picked their side tonight. Death and destruction for our entire planet. I cannot roll my eyes hard enough at this story. First off, babe, stop giving yourself so much credit. You didn't shut down the Congressional Baseball Game. You briefly disrupted it and got to spend the night in jail. Congrats, I guess? I just don't understand how anybody thinks these tactics are compelling or win people over. I've never once seen lunatics storm the field and disrupt a game I'm trying to watch and been like, I should really get on board with what those guys are selling. That's never been me. I don't know, maybe I'm missing something, but that has simply never been me. And I do acknowledge that climate change is a real issue that we need to address. I recently saw Bill Gates talk about how he's involved in the opening of a new high-tech, cutting-edge nuclear power plant in the US for the first time in years. And I think that's amazing. That's low-cost, almost zero pollution energy that we should and can be expanding and investing in if we can just get government bureaucrats and red tape out of the way. But a call to end fossil fuels is absurd. There's no practical way to do that without massively impoverishing people and drastically sabotaging development and living standards and health. And even if we somehow could, unless the rest of the world, namely India and China, were also going to stop fossil fuels and stop all carbon emissions, spoiler alert, They are not going to do that. The trajectory of climate change might be somewhat altered, but it would still be going in the direction that it's going. So we've got toxic and unhinged tactics paired with a wild and unrealistic demand, distracting from reasonable and more realistic paths and avenues towards addressing this actual issue. Y'all are just doing great. Keep up the good work. A+ for activism. I'll also just briefly say that targeting this event in particular with this kind of behavior is really reckless, because you guys might remember that a few years back, Republican members of Congress faced an assassination attempt while practicing for the Congressional Baseball Game. So to choose this as an event to storm the field, given that you know there's going to be hyper security and an increased sensitivity over danger at this kind of event now, is just reckless. Like this, no one was hurt, and I'm glad, but this could have gone very differently for the protesters. It's all just an absolute clown show, but unfortunately, that's kind of par for the course for far-left activism these days. Speaking of the left, an interesting story was just published by Time magazine where they did an investigation and exposed some pretty transparent and extreme bias at the New York Times. So in the publishing industry, one of the biggest things that can happen is to get your book as an author onto the New York Times bestseller list. But for years, conservatives and right-leaning publishers have complained that they really can't get their books on there as easily as everyone else can, even when their sales numbers are incredibly strong. To be clear, a fair number of conservative authors do get on there, but there's been a number of instances where they don't, and it's not clear why based on book sales. The allegation that the Times bestseller list is biased against conservatives has been around for a long time, but Time magazine did an extensive data analysis, and they concluded that it's true. They are really biased against right-leaning authors. As you can see from this graph that they published, conservative publishers versus other publishers are significantly less likely to get on the New York Times bestseller list, even when they have the same weekly sales ranking. Of course, it's hardly shocking that the New York Times would have a liberal bias, but it is significant for the publishing industry and for these authors and publishing houses on the right that are being unfairly discriminated against. As Time explains, the fairness of the New York Times list is not merely a question of politics. Bestseller status helps an author sell more books, generating speaking fees, and negotiate better contracts for future book deals. As other newspapers have done away with their lists and bookstores have closed in recent decades, the New York Times list is even more important. It is supposed to function as a reflection of what the public is reading, and it influences what consumers may want to read. It's just not fair to these authors or their publishers that they can get the same amount of book sales as another book, but not make the list because of their viewpoint or perspective. That's not what the list is supposed to be. It's not supposed to be a list of liberal book recommendations. It's supposed to be a bestsellers list, aka based on book sales. They're not doing their job as journalists. They're masquerading as journalists, but really doing activism, and in the process, robbing the public of information we need to know. As Time points out, a more transparent list would also be more useful. If Alex Jones, a controversial far-right conspiracy theorist, was indeed the second-place best-selling author in America, as BookScan says he was in August 2022, with a title that was omitted from the New York Times list, people should probably know that. His enduring popularity says a lot about the country and its readers, who are not willing to close the book on him. I completely agree. It's not the New York Times' job to decide which authors are acceptable enough to be on the list of bestsellers. It's their job to look at book sales and then tell us who's selling the most books. There's a fundamental arrogance and elitism underlying this bias, that they look down on the average American so much they think they need to be sheltered from dangerous ideas or bad information or the very bad people, and that they, in their benevolence with their fancy degrees and their elite education, they know what's best, what books Americans can handle being informed about. I reject that premise entirely, and I think it's really unfair to everyone involved, especially the readers. But what do you think? Do you still consult the New York Times bestseller list? I know it's somewhat waned in its influence, but a lot of people still do look to it. Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to hit that like button while you're at it. And now we're going to talk about an interesting idea that former President Trump just floated, suggesting that federal income tax on tips, like those earned by waiters or waitresses, should be entirely eliminated. Let's take a look at what he had to say.
This is the first time I've said this, and for those hotel workers and people that get tips, you're going to be very happy, because when I get to office, we are going to not charge taxes on tips, people making tips. We're not going to do it, and we're going to do that right away, first thing in office, because it's been a point of contention for years and years and years, and you do a great job of service, you take care of people, and I think it's going to be something that really is deserved. More importantly, popular or unpopular. I do some unpopular things, too, if it's right for the country. I do what's right. But so those people that have jobs in restaurants, whatever the job may be, a tipping job, we're not going after for taxes anymore. This will be ended. And I announced that for the first time I've brought it up. First time anyone's brought it up. I think it's never been brought up before, and I also think it's very appropriate.
So, I have mixed feelings on this one. On the one hand, I think the government wastes a ton of our money. I hate taxes, and I want Americans to pay as little as possible to the government. On the other hand, we're already drowning in debt, and this would eliminate billions of dollars in revenue that, without accompanying spending cuts, would lead to even bigger budget deficits and an even worse national debt problem. Now, setting that aside, because that concern could be alleviated simply by cutting some spending to justify the tax cut, there's something kind of unfair about this as opposed to just a across-the-board tax reduction. I feel bad for all the waiters and waitresses out there who have to pay taxes, hefty taxes on their tips, and are struggling to get by. I really do. But it doesn't make much sense to me why a hostess, for example, who is paid hourly and gets $17 an hour, would have to pay federal taxes on the money she makes, but a waitress who makes almost all their money in tips would just be untaxed on their earnings. That doesn't really seem fair. The tax code should be as neutral as possible. It shouldn't favor some groups over others. Now, of course, it does in tons of ways, and this would just be yet another one added to the infinite length and complexity of our tax system. And I get why Trump's proposing it, right? It would help working class people who need help and should be able to keep more of their paychecks. But I'm just not so sure that should be done in a way that would have an economic distortion, in that it would really encourage people to quit their job and start working in a tip job, and also would favor some people over others in how much of the tax burden they have to bear for no real reason. Like, there's no real distinction between working at the hostess stand and being a waitress that means one person should have to pay a ton in taxes and the other should have to pay almost none. It seems like the kind of thing that is intended to go over well politically, but maybe hasn't been fully fleshed out as a policy proposal. But what do you guys think? I'm really curious to get your thoughts on this one. Let me know in the comments. And now it's time for Brad versus TikTok, my daily segment where I take on the craziest ideas from the Clock app.
Pronoun of the day is slugs.
Today, we have a TikToker helpfully explaining to us why she's a huge fan of communism. Make sure you're subscribed and stick around, and don't forget to hit that like button to reward my suffering. I lose brain cells for your enjoyment. Now let's hear what our friend here had to say.
What do I like about communism? Mostly the increased life expectancy thing. I think that's good when people live longer. I like that.
Communism was responsible for tens and tens of millions of deaths in the 20th century. From famines to intentional mass murders, everything from Lenin's Russia to Mao's China, where communism has been tried, resulted in millions and millions of deaths. And the country with the highest life expectancy in the world is actually Hong Kong, a bastion of free market capitalism. Also up there are Switzerland and Finland, which too are market-based economies, not communist utopias. So I'm just really not sure what Girly here is popping off about, but hey, let's keep hearing her out.
Also, the 100% literacy rates or near 100% literacy rates, I think that's pretty cool. I'm into that. I like it when people are educated and can read.
So, do communist countries usually have high literacy rates? Yes, they do. I'm happy to acknowledge that. And that is definitely positive, but it's not necessarily a 100% purely good thing. For example, as one Cuban dissident explained in an NBC News article, communist governments' literacy programs are often used as a form of indoctrination to spread propaganda favorable to the state and lies and misinformation about its enemies and its critics. And you just don't need a communist society to have high literacy rates. Finland and Norway have 100% literacy rates. They are not communist. The United Kingdom has a 99% literacy rate. It is not communist. Obviously, we want people to be literate, but we don't need communism for that, babe. Also, when we're looking at communist governments and their 100% literacy rates, we should be a little skeptical of those figures because they are ultimately, in many cases, coming from those governments' data itself. For example, North Korea claims to have a 100% literacy rate, but I don't buy that for a second. Millions of people in North Korea are living in absolute poverty, and you're telling me they have a 100% literacy rate? Color me skeptical on that one. But this next part of the video is where things got unhinged.
That whole thing with the billionaires, I don't not like it. That's when I'm going to feel comfortable saying on the internet about that. I don't not like it.
And now we're openly supporting the murder of billionaires. That's totally normal, sane behavior. Look, I can be friends with somebody who's on the far left who literally thinks billionaires shouldn't exist and they want to tax all their money away. I strongly disagree with that. We can have a debate and I can respect you as a friend and as a person, even if you and I have very different views on economics and taxes and all that stuff. But if you want to kill them, I'm sorry. That's evil. You're nuts. If you fantasize about murdering wealthy people, you are unwell. None of the problems in your life exist because other people are successful. And you don't have a right to kill someone because you're pissed off about how much money they have. Your delulu is showing. She's also apparently really into trains.
And also, you know what? I'm going to say, surprisingly train-focused communism. Lots of stuff about expanding rail lines, improving transportation, building high-speed rails. I saw a video of some communists building a train station in 8 hours. I live in LA. I got friends who live in New York. You ever taken a subway here? You ever taken a subway in beautiful United States of America? You ever compared what the subway stations here look like compared to commie subway stations? You ever look that up? The subway stations under communism are looking real good.
So now this is hilarious because she's just literally fallen for the communist propaganda. In the Soviet Union, for example, they famously invested tons of money in building these pristine and beautiful subway stations so that tourists and journalists would come see them and talk about how advanced and sophisticated the USSR was, when in reality, their economy was stagnating and their people weren't free. The communist train station thing is literally government propaganda from communist leaders who were trying to confuse and mislead useful idiots in the West. Got to give them credit on that one, I guess, because it seems like it worked.
So yeah, I think that's my final answer. Life expectancy going up, literacy rates nearing 100%, homeownership rates nearing 100%, and more trains and the train stations. I'm going to say beautiful. Maybe a little economic democracy. You know what I'm saying? You picking up what I'm putting down there? A little economic democracy. That's what I'm in favor of. Sometimes economic democracy looks like that rich guy over there just getting handled. That's it.
Oh.
By rich guy, I don't mean like your uncle who's an orthodontist who makes $250,000 a year. That's not what I'm talking about there. Please, I live in LA, okay? An average house here is like $1 million, all right? I'm talking rich guys. You know what I'm saying.
So we're back to the murdering rich people thing again. I don't really know what to say. That's evil. You don't get to kill somebody because you're envious of them and how successful they have been. Murder is bad, regardless of the respective wealth levels of the people involved. Am I going crazy that that's like somehow now a controversial concept? And as far as your economic democracy argument, you can f*** off with that. My money is my money. My labor is my labor. My company is my company. As long as I'm not actively harming anyone else, I should be free to do with it what I want. It's my livelihood, and by extension, my life. It shouldn't be up for a vote. It shouldn't be whatever the people feel like. It's my life, it's my money, it's my work. With the democracy. There's no democracy about my life and my choices, which is ultimately what economic decisions are. Now, what disturbs me about this video and this individual is that this is not just the late night thoughts of one random person after the edible hits too hard. This woman has 1.8 million followers and tens of thousands of adoring young people clapped along like seals to this video and left comments or hit that like button on it and apparently agree with this radical, afactual nonsense. That's what really concerns me about this content and these economic conversations on TikTok more broadly. But what do you think? What's your take on this video? Did I miss anything in my rebuttal? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to hit that like button. Now, before we wrap up today's show, I'll read a couple of your comments you left on yesterday's episode. One person writes, Brad, either you respect the right to free speech or you don't, but don't be a hypocrite about it. You may find the content of the language of the schoolboy more acceptable than that of the TikTok girl, but that is exactly the point. You don't have to like it, you just have to tolerate it. Well, hang on there. Let me explain a key difference. The first situation is about what a boy can do at a public school, which is a government institution bound by the First Amendment. The other one is about whether a private business can or should fire an employee who says something trollish and offensive online. That doesn't involve the First Amendment. It's not about the government. And so I do think those are different situations that you can have nuanced positions on. I hope that helps you understand where I'm coming from, but if you still disagree, that's fine. Another person writes, why are this child's parents allowing him to wear this inflammatory shirt to school? This story is a masterclass in requiring school uniforms. Brad, would you support a kid wearing a t-shirt that says God only supports one man plus one woman? So this was interesting to me because I think we've hit on a common misconception. Supporting a legal right or a First Amendment right to do something is not the same as personally condoning or supporting that conduct. So if I had a child, I probably wouldn't send them to school in that kind of a t-shirt that's meant to troll other students. I would encourage them to speak their mind and hold their views if the topic of gender came up in a discussion, but I wouldn't want them wearing sassy t-shirts meant to antagonize other people's perspectives. I just don't love that as an approach. And as a parent, I don't think I would allow it. But the First Amendment is a different question. It's about what do they have the legal right to do? And if the school's going to allow students on the other side to have their messages on their shirts, they have to allow both. I agree with you. They could just ban all messages. Everyone must wear plain blue collared t-shirts as a school uniform. That would be allowed. I would be fine with that. But what they can't do, and I'm never going to support them doing, is picking and choosing which ideas are okay and which are not. Hey Brad, I've seen this book in the background of your videos. It's the basic economics book you have there. Who is the author? I can't tell since the name is blurry. Well, the book is by Thomas Sowell, the economist, and it's a good read. It's a little dense, but it's kind of a layperson's guide to economics. Another person writes, thank you very much for having moral backbone, Brad Polumbo. You are a dear person. I reiterate Brad Polumbo for president. Sir, ma'am, if you like me so much, why do you want me to suffer and ruin my life? Running for president sounds terrible, and I will never say never, but I don't think I'll be doing that. Another person writes, you always upload these podcasts at 12 a.m. since I'm from Spain, so it's always my little treat when I wake up and I'm getting ready for the day. Oh, I love that. I'm really happy you can enjoy them whenever it works for you, and that's one of the great things about this medium and this platform. I've actually been to Spain twice. I've been to both Madrid and Barcelona, and I think it's a beautiful place. It's so cool to me that I have viewers and listeners from all across the globe. Honestly, it's humbling and it's an honor. Anyway, guys, that is it for today's episode of the Brad vs. Everyone podcast. Thanks so much for tuning in. Please do consider subscribing and sticking around if you're new here. Don't forget to hit that like button on your way out and do comment with your thoughts on today's episode. I pick a few comments to respond to in every video. And with that, we'll talk again tomorrow.